The cold April rain mixed with ash fell on Berlin like tears from a dying sky. 14-year-old Klaus pressed his back against a broken wall, his fingers wrapped around a rifle that felt heavier than his entire body. The weapon was a Karabiner 98K, the same gun his father had carried before a Soviet bullet found him near Stalingrad 3 years ago. Klaus had never fired it at a person. He prayed he would never have to. The uniform on his thin frame belonged to the Hitler Youth, the Nazi organization that had transformed millions of German boys into soldiers. What started as camping trips and songs around fires had become something dark and terrible. By 1945, Germany was desperate. The war was lost, but nobody dared say it out loud. So they gave children guns and told them to fight. Klaus was not alone in his hiding spot beneath the ruined building. Beside him crouched Hans, a small boy of 13 with dirt covering his face like war paint. Hans had lost his entire family when Allied bombers destroyed their apartment building in Hamburg. He had nowhere to go except forward in a battle. On Klaus's other side sat Friedrich, 15 years old with eyes that looked much older. Friedrich Harali spoke an Amore. He had seen things in the Hitler Youth training that stole his words away. Their leader was Werner, a 16-year-old true believer who wore his Nazi armband like a badge of honor. Werner's father was a high-ranking SS officer, and the boy had drunk deeply from the well of Nazi propaganda. Even now, with Soviet forces crushing Berlin from the east and American forces pushing from the west, Werner believed in final victory. He believed in dying for the Führer. The bridge they were ordered to defend meant nothing. It was a small stone bridge over a stream that barely qualified as a river. The water below was brown with pollution and debris. But orders were orders, and boys like Klaus had learned not to question. Questioning meant being called a traitor. Traitors were hanged from lampposts with signs around their necks. Klaus had seen 3 such bodies just yesterday. The date was April 25, 1945. In his history classes, before the schools were bombed into rubble, Klaus had learned that wars were glorious. Teachers had shown maps of German conquests across Europe, spreading like a great wave. They had called it destiny. They had called it necessary. Nobody had mentioned that wars ended with children holding guns they could barely lift, waiting to die for a bridge that did not matter. The sound reached them first. It was a deep rumbling that Klaus felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. Tanks. American tanks. The M4 Sherman tanks that had rolled across France and into Germany were now just blocks away. Klaus had seen pictures of them in propaganda papers that called them weak and inferior. The papers had lied about many things. Werner grabbed Klaus's shoulder hard enough to hurt. His eyes were wild with fear disguised as excitement. "Remember your training?" Werner hissed. "We fight to the last man. We make them pay for every inch of German soil. We die as heroes." Klaus looked at Hans. The younger boy was shaking, not from cold, though the April air was freezing. Hans was shaking because he was terrified, and no amount of Hitler Youth training could hide that simple truth. Friedrich stared at nothing, his rifle resting loose in his hands like he had forgotten it was there. The rumbling grew louder. Then Klaus saw them through the smoke and rain. 3 American tanks rolled down the broken street, their treads crushing rubble into dust. Behind the tanks came soldiers on foot, moving carefully from cover to cover. They wore different uniforms than Klaus expected. Propaganda had shown Americans as weak and cowardly. These men moved like professionals, like hunters who knew their prey. Werner raised his rifle. "On my command," he whispered. "We fire together. Aim for the soldiers, not the tanks. Make every bullet count." Klaus's heart hammered in his chest. His mother's face flashed in his memory. She had died 6 months ago when a British bomb hit the factory where she worked making uniforms. Her last words to him had been simple: "Live, Klaus. Just live." But how could he live if he refused to fight? Werner would shoot him as a deserter. The Nazi officers who still prowled the ruins would hang him. The American soldiers were close now. Klaus could see their faces beneath their helmets. They looked tired. They looked human. One of them appeared older, maybe 30, with sergeant stripes on his sleeve. He was calling out something in English that Klaus could not understand. The tone sounded almost gentle, which made no sense at all that Werner's finger tightened on his trigger. Klaus watched it happen as if time had slowed to a crawl. The rain fell between heartbeats. The tank treads turned with the sound of grinding metal. Hans whimpered beside him, a sound like a puppy makes when it is hurt. Klaus made a choice in that frozen moment. He pointed his rifle toward the Americans, but his hand shook so badly that he could not have hit anything even if he tried. His finger found the trigger, cold metal against cold skin. The American sergeant was 20 meters away now, close enough that Klaus could see the color of his eyes. They were blue, like Klaus's own eyes, like the eyes of his dead father. The sergeant raised his hand slowly, palms out. He said something in broken German, his accent terrible, but his words clear enough. Kinder. Children. It is over. Werner fired first. His shot went wide, cracking into the brick wall behind the Americans. Everything exploded into chaos and noise. The gunshot shattered the moment like glass breaking. Werner's bullet missed every American soldier and sparked against stone. Before any of the boys could fire a second shot, the world became a storm of movement and shouting. American soldiers rushed forward with speed that shocked Klaus. Within seconds, rough hands grabbed his rifle and tore it from his grip. Someone pushed him face down into the mud. Klaus waited for the bullet. Propaganda had taught him that Americans executed prisoners, especially child soldiers. His mother's last words echoed in his mind. Live, Klaus. Live. But how could he live now? He squeezed his eyes shut and waited for death. It did not come. Instead, hands pulled him to his feet, gentler than he expected. Klaus opened his eyes to find himself staring at the American sergeant. Up close, the man looked even more tired than before. Lines creased his face, and gray touched his brown hair at the temples. His blue eyes studied Klaus with an expression that confused the boy completely. It was not anger. It was not hatred. It looked almost like sadness. Jesus Christ, the sergeant muttered in English. They're just kids. Another American soldier appeared, younger than the sergeant but older than Klaus. He wore glasses and spoke in German, though his accent marked him as foreign. How old are you? He asked Klaus. That Klaus's voice cracked when he answered. 14. The translator's face hardened. He turned to the sergeant and said something in English that made the older man's jaw clench. Klaus would learn later that the translator's name was Private Danny Cohen, and that Cohen had lost his grandparents, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, and 7 cousins in the Nazi death camps. Cohen had every reason to hate Klaus and the uniform he wore. But Cohen did not pull his trigger either. Hans was crying. The 13-year-old sat in the mud with his hands over his face, his whole body shaking with sobs. An American soldier crouched beside him and offered a canteen of water. Hans flinched away like the canteen might explode. The American set it down within reach and backed away, his hands visible and empty. Friedrich stood perfectly still, looking at nothing. 2 American soldiers had disarmed him without resistance. He had not fought at all. His eyes were empty holes in his face. Werner was different. The 16-year-old struggled against the soldiers holding him, screaming Nazi slogans and curses. Traitors, he spat at Klaus and the others. Cowards, you should die fighting. The Führer will curse your names. The American sergeant walked over to Werner. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, but his voice came out calm and low. Son, he said in English, then waited for Cohen to translate. The war is over. You don't have to die today. Werner spat at his feet. The sergeant sighed and gestured to his men. They led Werner away, separately from the other boys. Klaus would not see him again for many weeks. Later, Klaus would learn that Werner spent his first month in American custody fighting every kindness shown to him. Convinced it was a trick, the sergeant returned to Klaus. He reached out slowly, like someone approaching a frightened animal, and removed Klaus's helmet. Klaus's blonde hair fell into his eyes, greasy and unwashed. The sergeant's expression softened even more. Mike Thompson, the sergeant said, pointing to himself. Then he pointed to Klaus and raised his eyebrows in question. Klaus, the boy whispered. Klaus Weber. Thompson nodded. He pulled something from his pocket and held it out. It was a photograph, bent and worn from being carried. The picture showed a woman with kind eyes and two children, a boy and a girl, both younger than Klaus. They stood in front of a white house with a tree in the yard. They were smiling. Thompson tapped the photograph and spoke in English. Cohen translated. Sergeant Thompson says these are his children. The boy is 8. The girl is 10. He says you remind him of his son. Klaus stared at the photograph. The boy in the picture wore clean clothes and held a baseball glove. He looked healthy and fed and safe. Klaus tried to remember feeling safe. The memory would not come. Thompson produced another item from his pack. It was a chocolate bar, a Hershey bar that American soldiers carried as rations. He broke off a piece and offered it to Klaus. The boy's stomach clenched with hunger. He had not eaten chocolate in 3 years. He had barely eaten at all in 3 weeks. But taking food from the enemy felt like another kind of surrender. Thompson saw the hesitation. He smiled, just a small movement of his lips, and took a bite of the chocolate himself. Not poisoned, the gesture said. Safe. Then he offered it again. Klaus's hand moved before his brain could stop it. He took the chocolate. The sweetness exploded on his tongue like a memory of better days. His eyes filled with tears he did not want to shed, not in front of these men, not in front of Hans and Friedrich. But the tears came anyway. Thompson's big hand settled on Klaus's shoulder. Not rough, not painful, almost like how Klaus's father used to touch him, back before the war ate everything good in the world. The sergeant said something in English, his voice gentle. Cohen translated. He says you are safe now. He says nobody will hurt you. He says you were just a child, and this was never your war to fight. Klaus did not believe him. How could he? The world had taught Klaus that kindness was weakness, that mercy was stupidity, that enemies were monsters. But Thompson's hand stayed steady on his shoulder. The chocolate melted on Klaus's tongue. Hans had stopped crying and was drinking from the canteen. Even Friedrich's empty eyes had flickered with something that might have been hope. American soldiers gathered the 3 boys together. They gave them more water and what looked like crackers with strange meat inside. They spoke in low voices that did not sound angry. One soldier offered Hans a blanket when the boys started shivering, but a truck arrived to take them away. Klaus climbed in on legs that barely worked. Thompson climbed in beside them, which surprised Klaus. The sergeant did not have to come, but he sat across from the boys and watched them with those sad blue eyes. The truck rolled through the ruins of Germany toward something Klaus could not imagine. He clutched the chocolate wrapper in his fist like proof that the last 10 minutes had actually happened. The truck ride lasted 3 hours through a Germany that Klaus barely recognized. Every town they passed was broken. Buildings stood like hollow teeth against gray skies. Craters filled streets where bombs had fallen. People wandered through ruins with empty faces, searching for food or family or reasons to keep breathing. The mighty German Reich that propaganda had promised would last 1,000 years had survived 12 and left behind only ashes. Klaus dozed against the truck's metal side, exhausted beyond words. When he woke, Hans was asleep against his shoulder. Friedrich stared out the back of the truck at the destruction scrolling past. Sergeant Thompson sat across from them, still watching, still present. Klaus wondered if the American ever slept. They arrived at Camp Lucky Strike as the sun was setting. Klaus expected a prison. Barbed wire, guard towers, machine guns pointed inward. The propaganda had shown American POW camps as death factories where Germans starved and suffered. But when the truck stopped and soldiers helped them down, Klaus saw something different. The camp sprawled across former German military barracks that American forces had captured and transformed. Yes, there was a fence, but the gates stood open. Children walked freely between buildings, and Klaus could hear voices, even laughter. Actual laughter, a sound Klaus had nearly forgotten existed. "Welcome to Lucky Strike," Cohen said in German, appearing beside the truck. "It's a processing center for displaced German youth. Mostly Hitler Youth members like you, some younger children separated from families. You'll stay here until we figure out what to do with you." A woman in an American Army uniform approached. She was perhaps 30 years old with red hair pulled back and green eyes that held warmth Klaus had not seen in years. She smiled at the boys, and the smile reached her eyes, which meant it was real. I'm Captain Sarah Miller, she said in perfect German. I'm a nurse, and I run the medical and education programs here. You boys look exhausted. Let's get you fed, cleaned up, and assigned beds. Tomorrow we'll talk about everything else. Klaus found his voice. You speak German. My grandparents came from Munich, Miller explained. I grew up speaking it at home. Now come on. You're safe here. That word again. Safe. Klaus did not know how to believe it. The next hours passed in a blur of overwhelming newness. American soldiers led them to a building with real showers, hot water steaming in clean stalls. Klaus stood under the spray until his skin turned pink, washing away weeks of dirt and blood and the smell of fear. They gave him clean clothes, not a uniform, but simple civilian clothes that almost fit. They gave him a bed with actual sheets and a pillow that felt like sleeping on clouds. The dining hall shocked Klaus most of all. Long tables filled with boys his age, maybe 200 in total, all eating real food. Hot food, meat and potatoes and bread and vegetables. American soldiers moved between tables, serving portions and answering questions. Some soldiers even sat with the boys, talking and sometimes laughing. Klaus sat with Hans and Friedrich. A soldier placed a tray in front of each of them piled higher with food than Klaus had seen in months. His stomach cramped just looking at it. Hans grabbed his fork and started eating like a starving animal. Friedrich stared at his tray as if it might disappear. Eat slowly, a voice said in German. Klaus looked up to find Sergeant Thompson standing beside their table. Your stomachs have been empty too long. Eat too fast, and you'll be sick. I've seen it happen. Thompson sat down across from them. He had his own tray, eating the same food the boys ate. Klaus watched him carefully cut his meat and take small bites. Klaus copied him, forcing himself to go slow even though every instinct screamed to shove food in his mouth as fast as possible. The food tasted better than Klaus remembered food could taste. The meat was tender. The potatoes were rich with butter. The bread was soft and warm. Klaus's eyes watered again, and he hated himself for being so weak, for crying over something as simple as a meal. Thompson noticed. He always noticed. It's okay, he said quietly. You're allowed to feel things. You're allowed to be human again. After dinner, Captain Miller showed them to their barracks. It was a large room with 20 beds, 10 on each side. Other boys were already there, some reading, some talking quietly, some just lying down and staring at the ceiling. Klaus noticed they were all young, nobody older than 17. You'll sleep here tonight, Miller explained. Tomorrow we'll do medical examinations. Nothing invasive, just checking you're healthy. Then we start the process of figuring out what comes next for each of you. Some boys have family members we can locate. Some will go to orphanages or foster homes. Some might even have other options. But all of that is tomorrow's worry. Tonight you sleep. Klaus chose a bed near a window. Hans took the bed next to him, and Friedrich took the one on Hans's other side. They lay down in their clean clothes on clean sheets with full stomachs for the first time in forever. Klaus waited for someone to tell him it was a trick, that the beds would be taken away, that the food had been poisoned, that guards would come in the night with guns and rage. Instead, the lights dimmed but did not go completely dark. A single American soldier sat in a chair near the door, reading a book. A guard, Klaus realized, but one who seemed more interested in his book than the children around him. The soldier looked up, caught Klaus watching, and gave him a small wave. Then he went back to reading. Hans fell asleep within minutes, his breathing evening out into soft snores. Friedrich took longer, but eventually his eyes closed. Klaus lay awake, his mind racing. Outside the window, he could see other buildings, paths lit by electric lights that actually worked, and in the distance, the fence with its open gate that he could leave if he wanted. The realization hit him slowly. Nobody was really stopping them. The gate stood open. The guard was reading. This was not a prison. This was something else entirely, something Klaus had no words for. Across the room, another boy stirred and called out in his sleep, German words twisted by nightmares. The guard set down his book, walked over quietly, and placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder until the nightmare passed. Then he returned to his chair and his book. Klaus finally closed his eyes. Sleep came faster than expected, deep and dreamless. the first real sleep he had experienced in months. 6 months changed everything. Klaus woke in his bed at Camp Lucky Strike to September sunshine streaming through windows. Outside, the trees had begun to turn gold and red. The war had been over since May when Germany officially surrendered, but the surrender on paper meant little to boys who still carry the war inside their bones. Klaus sat up and stretched. His body had changed in these months. Regular meals had added weight to his frame. His cheeks had filled out. His arms showed muscle instead of just bone and skin. He looked like a healthy 14-year-old should look, though his eyes remained older than his years. The barracks was mostly empty this early. Hans had already left for breakfast. Friedrich's bed was made with military precision, a habit none of them could break. But Friedrich himself was probably in the chapel, where he spent hours every day trying to pray away the things he had done during the war. Captain Miller worried about Friedrich. So did Klaus. Klaus dressed in the American-style clothes he now wore every day, blue jeans and a white shirt. He had learned to tie his shoes the American way, to eat with a fork instead of just a spoon, to say please and thank you in English. Private Cohen had been patient with his language lessons, teaching him new words every day. Klaus could now hold basic conversations in English, though he still thought in German. The biggest change was not physical or educational. The biggest change lived in Klaus's chest, in the space where constant fear used to sit. He felt almost calm now, almost safe. The word still scared him because safety could be taken away, but he was learning to trust it. He walked to breakfast along paths he knew by heart now. Other boys called out greetings in German and English. Klaus waved back. He had made something like friends here, boys who understood what he had been through because they had lived it too. They did not talk about the war often, but knowing someone else understood, that was enough. The dining hall buzzed with activity and conversation. Klaus grabbed a tray and loaded it with scrambled eggs, toast, and fruit. Real fruit, apples from somewhere that still had orchards. He sat at his usual table, where Hans was already eating and telling a story that made the other boys laugh. "Klaus," Hans called out, waving him over. "I was just telling everyone about the baseball game yesterday. You should have seen Friedrich try to hit the ball. He swung so hard he spun around twice." Klaus smiled. Hans had adapted fastest to this new life. The 13-year-old now spoke English better than Klaus did, played baseball with actual skill, and seemed to have pushed the war into some locked room in his mind. Klaus worried sometimes that Hans was pretending too hard, that one day that locked room would burst open. But for now, Hans smiled and laughed, and maybe that was enough. Klaus was halfway through breakfast when Sergeant Thompson entered the dining hall. The big American searched the room until his eyes found Klaus. Then he smiled, that gentle smile Klaus had learned to recognize, and walked over. "Morning, Klaus," Thompson said in English, then added in broken German, "Guten Morgen." "Good morning, Sergeant Thompson," Klaus replied in English, proud of his pronunciation. "Call me Mike," Thompson said, as he did every time. They had this conversation almost daily. Klaus could not bring himself to use the sergeant's first name. It felt too familiar, too disrespectful. "I have something to talk to you about," Thompson continued, his expression turning serious. "Can you come to Captain Miller's office after breakfast?" Klaus's stomach dropped. Serious conversations usually meant bad news. Boys were being sent away from Camp Lucky Strike regularly now, shipped off to orphanages or to relatives who had survived the war. Klaus had no relatives. His father was dead at Stalingrad. His mother was dead in the bombing raids. His grandparents had died before the war. He was completely alone. "Yes, sir," Klaus said quietly. Thompson's hand landed on his shoulder, warm and steady. "It's good news, son. I promise. Finish your breakfast." Klaus could not finish his breakfast. His appetite had vanished. Hans noticed his change in mood and stopped talking. Even Friedrich, who had just arrived, looked concerned. An hour later, Klaus knocked on the door to Captain Miller's office. Her voice called him in. He opened the door to find both Miller and Thompson waiting, along with Private Cohen to translate. All three smiled at him, which confused Klaus even more. "Sit down, Klaus," Miller said gently, gesturing to a chair. Klaus sat. His hands gripped his knees to keep them from shaking. Thompson cleared his throat. He looked nervous, which Klaus had never seen before. The big sergeant who had faced down child soldiers with such calm now fidgeted with papers on Miller's desk. "Klaus," Thompson began, then paused. "I've been visiting you regularly since April. You know that." Klaus nodded. Thompson came to Camp Lucky Strike 3 times a week, always spending time with Klaus, Hans, and Friedrich. He brought them books in German and English. He taught Klaus about America, about Iowa where Thompson lived, about normal life in a place where wars did not reach. He had shown Klaus probably 50 photographs of his family by now. "My wife Mary and I," Thompson continued, "we've been talking. We've been talking to the army, to lawyers, to everyone we could find who might help. Klaus, we would like to adopt you. We would like you to come to America and become part of our family." The words hit Klaus like a physical blow. He stared at Thompson, unable to process what he had just heard. Adopt. Family. America. The words were English, and Klaus knew what they meant individually, but together they made no sense at all. "I don't understand," Klaus whispered in German. Cohen translated Thompson's response. "Mike and his wife want you to be their son. They want to take you home to Iowa, to live in their house, to go to American schools, to have a real life. They have 2 children already, and they want you to be the third. They want to be your parents." Klaus's vision blurred. Tears spilled down his cheeks before he could stop them. He had cried more in the last 6 months than in all the years before, but these tears were different. They were not tears of fear or pain or loss. They were something else entirely, something Klaus had no name for. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why would you do this?" Thompson knelt down in front of Klaus's chair, so their eyes were level. He spoke slowly in English, and Cohen translated each sentence. "Because you're a good kid who got dealt a bad hand. Because you deserve a chance at a real childhood. Because my son is your age, and when I look at you, I see him. Because it's the right thing to do. Because I want to." He pulled out another photograph, this one new. It showed his family standing in front of that White House, but someone had drawn an extra figure into the picture with pencil, a boy standing between Thompson's 2 children. "Mary drew you in," Thompson said. "She's been writing letters to the adoption agencies for months. She wants to meet you. The kids want to meet you. We want you to come home." Home. Klaus had not had a home since the bombs fell. The ship left Bremen on a cold morning in November 1946. Klaus stood at the railing as Germany disappeared behind fog and distance. 18 months ago, he had been a soldier. Now he wore a new coat that Mary Thompson had sent, blue wool that smelled like soap and hope. Beside him stood Mike Thompson, no longer sergeant, but just Mike now, though Klaus still could not call him that out loud. "Nervous?" Mike asked. Klaus nodded. Nervous did not cover it. Terrified fit better. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known, the language he thought in, the land that held his parents' graves, the only home he remembered. Even Friedrich's grave was in Germany now. Friedrich had taken his own life in August, unable to carry the weight of his wartime actions any longer. Klaus had helped bury him beneath a tree at Camp Lucky Strike. That grief sat heavy in Klaus's chest like a stone he would carry forever. But Hans had left for America 2 months ago, adopted by a Jewish couple in New York who had lost their own son in the war. Hans had written Klaus one letter so far, full of excitement about baseball games and something called hot dogs and how big everything was in New York City. If Hans could do it, maybe Klaus could too. The ship was called the USS General Blackmore, a troop transport converted to carry displaced persons and refugees to new lives. Hundreds of people filled the decks, speaking a dozen languages Klaus did not recognize. Women clutched children. Old men stared at the sea. Everyone was running from something, hoping for something, scared of something. Klaus and Mike shared a small cabin below deck. It had 2 narrow beds and a porthole window that showed only gray water. Klaus lay in his bed that first night while the ship rolled through Atlantic waves, and his stomach rolled with it. He had never been on a boat before. He did not like it. Mike sat on his own bed, writing a letter by lamplight. He wrote to Mary every day, long letters that he sealed and would mail when they reached America. Klaus wondered what Mike wrote about. Probably about Klaus, about whether this adoption was a mistake, about whether a boy raised by Nazis could ever become a real American. "Can't sleep?" Mike asked without looking up. "The boat moves too much," Klaus said in English. His accent was thick, but the words came easier now after months of practice. Mike set down his pen. My first time on a ship, I was sick for 3 days straight. Threw up everything I ate. The sailors said I'd get used to it, and they were right. Your body adapts. Did you go to war on a ship? Klaus asked. Mike nodded. Went to England first in 1943, then to France on D-Day. June 6th, 1944. That was a bad day, Klaus. A lot of men died on those beaches, but it was necessary to stop Hitler, to stop the Nazis from controlling Europe. You understand that now, don't you? Klaus did understand. The months at Camp Lucky Strike had slowly deprogrammed the lies the Hitler Youth had hammered into his brain. He had learned about the concentration camps, about the 6 million Jews murdered, about the evil his country had done. The shame of it would never leave him. But Captain Miller had taught him something important. She said Klaus was not responsible for what adults had done, that children forced into uniforms were victims too. Klaus tried to believe her. I am sorry, Klaus whispered. For the war. For everything Germany did. Mike moved to sit on Klaus's bed. The cabin was so small their knees almost touched. You don't have to apologize for things you didn't do. You were a child. You still are a child, though you've seen things no child should see. That's why I'm Mary, and I want to give you something different. A chance to just be a kid again. What if your children don't like me? Klaus asked, voicing the fear that kept him awake. What if I don't fit? What if I'm too broken? Mike's hand found Klaus's shoulder, that familiar touch that had become a language of its own. Then we'll work on it together. That's what families do. They don't give up on each other. The voyage took 12 days. Klaus spent the time learning more English from Mike, eating in the mess hall with other refugees, and watching the endless ocean. He thought about his parents often. His father would be proud, Klaus thought, that his son was getting a second chance. His mother would cry and smile at the same time. They lived in Klaus's memory, and he promised them silently that he would make this new life worth their sacrifices. That on the 12th day, someone shouted from the deck, "Land! I see land!" The cry went up in multiple languages, and people rushed to the railings. Klaus pushed through the crowd until he could see it. America! A smudge of darkness on the horizon that grew larger with each passing minute. As they entered New York Harbor, Klaus saw her. The Statue of Liberty rose from the water like something from a dream, green and massive and holding her torch high. Mike stood beside Klaus, watching him take it in. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, Mike said quietly. That's what's written on her base. It's about people like you, Klaus. People who need a new start. Klaus could not speak. His throat was too tight. The ship docked in chaos and noise. Immigration officers processed refugees in groups. Mike had special papers because of his army service, so they moved through faster than most. An officer stamped Klaus's documents, making him officially a resident of the United States, pending his adoption finalization. Then they were through, standing on American soil. Actually standing there. Klaus looked down at his feet like he could not quite believe they were touching this new country. Cars honked. People shouted. The air smelled different, felt different. Everything was enormous and fast and overwhelming. A woman's voice called out. Mike, over here. Klaus turned to see her. Mary Thompson was shorter than he expected, with brown hair and the same blue eyes her husband had. She wore a blue dress and held the hands of 2 children. The boy looked about 10 now, the girl maybe 12. They stared at Klaus with open curiosity. Mike waved and started walking toward his family. Klaus froze. This was it. This was the moment where everything became real. What if they rejected him? What if they took one look and realized they had made a terrible mistake? Mike turned back. Come on, son. Let's go home. So, the word unlocked Klaus's feet. He followed Mike across the busy dock until they reached the family. Mary let go of her children's hands and did something Klaus did not expect. She hugged him, just wrapped her arms around him like she had known him forever, like he was already hers. Welcome home, Klaus, she whispered in his ear. Welcome home. The boy, Tommy, offered his hand to shake very seriously. I'm Tommy. I'm supposed to share my room with you. Mom says you know how to speak German. That's really cool. The girl, Sarah, smiled shyly. I'm Sarah. I saved half my allowance to help buy you clothes. Do you like baseball? Tommy loves baseball. Klaus looked at these people, this family that was opening their lives to him. He looked at Mike, who was blinking back tears. He looked at Mary, who was smiling like he was the most precious thing in the world. He looked at Tommy and Sarah, who were treating him like a brother they had been waiting to meet. Something broke open in Klaus's chest. Not broken bad, broken open like a door that had been locked. Light poured in. He realized with sudden clarity that he was going to be okay. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. These people would help him get there. Yes, Klaus said in his accented English. I like baseball very much. They walked together to a car, a blue Ford that Mike loaded with suitcases. Klaus climbed in the back seat between Tommy and Sarah. As Mike started driving, Tommy began asking a million questions about Germany and what it was like on a ship, and did Klaus really know how to shoot a gun. Sarah elbowed her brother and told him to be polite. Klaus answered as best he could. He told them about the ship. He did not tell them about the gun. That story could wait. Maybe forever. They drove for hours through American countryside until they reached Iowa. The land was flat and golden with harvested cornfields. They drove through a small town called Waterloo and finally pulled up to a white house with a tree in the front yard. The house from the photographs. The house that was now going to be Klaus's home. Here we are, Mike said, turning off the engine. Welcome to the Thompson house. Klaus stepped out of the car and looked up at the house. It was perfect and normal and everything he had dreamed about during his worst nights at war. Mary took his hand, gentle but firm. You're safe now, she said. You're home. You're ours. Klaus believed her.